Good afternoon, welcome to another AP US History video with Mr. Pate. Today we're looking at the populace. Our essential questions for today are what issues caused the populace, the farmers, to organize a political party? And what was the legacy of the Populist Party? Here we go. Problems farmers faced. Farmers faced a variety of problems in the Gilded Age period, this kind of 1870s to 1890s period we've been looking at. One of these problems they faced was they had prices that were in decline. Prices were dropping on the core production crops like wheat and corn. At the same time, bank interest rates were going up, and new and ever improving farm machinery, including harvesters and combines and tractors, this was all going up in cost. They were getting better and at the same time more expensive. So farmers need the new machinery, they're having to pay a higher interest rate for it, and they're getting less money. This is not a good combination for farmers. Also, farmers were frustrated with railroads and big business that they felt gouged them on prices all over the place. Alright, so those are some of the problems farmers faced. These middlemen, the railroads, the banks, all were basically doing things that were not acting in the best interest of farmers, even a high tariff. Alright, well, so farmers, originally the Grange forms in the 1860s as kind of an opportunity to have, I guess, socialization. Farmers who were in a situation where they were lonely and isolated, the Grange initially starts up as a social opportunity. But farmers start to discuss their grievances, and it starts to become kind of a political collective. Farmers are going to at first pool their efforts and resources to have cooperatives where they might have like a big grain silo to store grain, and a bunch of farmers were going together on this. And then they would, not have to each be responsible for their own grain silo. They could harvest at slightly different times, they could be picked up, and they could share the cost of a good. The Grange is going to continue to grow, and by about late 1870s and into the early 1880s, you have the Farmers' Alliances. The Farmers' Alliances are going to not only be looking at the cooperatives, but they're going to start politically and legally getting active. Legally, they're going to take court cases. The case Munn versus Illinois is significant because it was a ruling that the state of Illinois could regulate the railroads so that they were not, they were doing things like they would have unpublished prices, they would give unfair rebates to big producers, and the small farmer would pay even larger amounts. And so farmers were angry about this, but there's nothing they could do. If they didn't have it shipped out on a railroad, they would lose everything. Wabash case overturns the Munn decision, correctly saying that only Congress, not a state, could regulate interstate commerce. That's true. But then the federal government does follow up with the Interstate Commerce Act, where this is an attempt to start regulating the railroads. There's also the Sherman Antitrust Act to try and regulate trusts. Neither of them are as effective as they will be later on when the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Federal Trade Commission replace the Sherman Antitrust Act. But the Interstate Commerce Act does get better over time. So these are at least efforts where the federal government's recognizing that the behavior of the railroads and the middlemen is not acceptable. All right. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act happened in 1890. Now, we had a previous video on the money question in the Gilded Age, and this talked about you had Bland Allison, and you had the efforts to get the greenbacks out of circulation and then start doing some limited silver purchasing all in the 1860s and 1870s. And here this issue has come back. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act allows a larger quantity of silver to be purchased and money added to the money supply. This makes farmers happy, and problems are going to emerge though. You have the Panic of 1893 occur. And when this occurs, President Grover Cleveland, who has just come into office and who is in favor of the gold standard, he is going to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act so that you go back to a more strict gold standard. Now, of course, when silver is added to the money supply, you end up with better prices for crops because those crops, you have inflation of the money, so it takes more dollars to buy the crops, so they get more money, which helps them combat the high interest rates on their loans they have. So this is as a result of the Panic of 1893. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act is repealed. This leads to a response by Coxey's army. Jacob Coxey is an Ohio businessman. He's going to come in and march with hundreds of other protesters on Washington, D.C. It's the first kind of march on Washington. And they're going to be asking for the federal government to reinstate unlimited coinage of silver, to drastically improve the money supply. They are also asking for the government to get involved hiring unemployed people. The Panic of 1893 was the worst panic to that point in U.S. history. There had never been anything quite as bad as it. So people were really upset and really hurting for a few years after 1893 while that lasted. All right. Well, so flipping back a little bit, the Populist Party, the Farmers' Alliances merged around 1890 into the Populist Party. And the Populist Party is going to run in 1892 its first national election. The Democratic Party had kind of gotten the South locked up. Republicans had a lot of the North locked up. And the Northeast wasn't really interested in what the farmers had to say. There were Southern members, white and black, of the Farmers' Alliance. They had their own groups that form in chunks of the National Populist Party. But its real strength lay in the West, and that's the only area it did do a lot and have a lot of success. Well, so it's not a factor nationally, but in the West they had some factor in statewide elections. So the silver issue really grows in importance after the Panic of 1893, and even more so than the other issues that are out there. The Populists did have other issues. Some of their other issues, going back to the Farmers' Alliance, they had even said, we want to have the federal government take control of transportation systems like railroads, the communication network. We want to have like the telegraph and now telephone. They wanted trust to be broken up. Well, the Populists go even farther and say we need a very activist government that's going to get involved and fix some of these problems. The government is going to be acting on behalf of the common citizen, reining in trusts, reining in the banks. Coinage of silver was the premier issue, but it was not the only issue. But they even said more direct democracy. We want to have a direct primary. We want to have direct election of senators. We want to have initiative and recall powers. So more direct democracy for citizens. Well, but when we get to the election of 1896, William Jennings Bryan is going to be both the Democratic candidate and the Populist Party candidate. He's going to, at his convention address, give a speech called the Cross of Gold speech, which you do want to remember. It's kind of the signature moment of the populist era and the populist movement. And the Cross of Gold speech, he says, you will not crucify this, these people, this country. You will not crucify it on a cross of gold. Basically saying the gold standard, gold of course, is the enemy of the common man. Well, the election ends in defeat. McKinley is able to win the election, and the Republicans win. So populism dies out. There was a little, I guess, silver lining for the farmers. By the turn of the century, a few years later, farm prices had improved. But the legacy really of the, so we talked about the issues earlier. What is the legacy of the Populist Party? The legacy that they have essentially is that all of these democratic issues, the regulation of big business and the railroads, the more direct democracy in society, those things we talked about, these things are going to come to fruition in the progressive era. Very few years later, you have this, people are kind of inspired by their example and people get interested and fired up about this. And so you end up with the legacy of the Populist Party being it leads to the progressive era. But that is all the time we have for today. Stay classy.